The Radical Secular Podcast. A demand for justice, equality, and rational public policy. Subscribe at YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and all the major podcast channels. Visit our website at theradicalsecular.com for articles, transcripts, and our complete library of episodes. Support us on Patreon, and follow us on social media.
Hello, and welcome back to The Radical Secular. I'm Joe Kipinti.
I'm Sean Prophet.
There's so much of this climate story, but the news flash is that climate disruptions are and have been a part of life for much of the world's population. We will talk about the science behind what is happening in our atmosphere due to human activity, more about the consequences, and then turn the conversation to renewable energy and other solutions. But first, I want to remind you to make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Monday at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles weekly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. I encourage you all to continue the conversation online. Please post replies on our Facebook page and on YouTube. Before we start, Sean, that was a pretty solid article you posted on the Radical Secular Journal on money. This is an issue we have a bit of disagreement about, you and I, but I have to say the essay really swayed me. Well done.
Thanks.
We should revisit, really, it was really a well done article. We should revisit this subject on the show, I think. I know you guys did a show on it months and months ago. We should probably do something on it again at some point. Have a look, everyone. It's really something we should all be informed about, as it affects our lives directly.
Well, yeah, and thanks for the kind words about the article. It is sort of a recap of what we went over in the money episode, but my different point this time was just to talk about this notion that a lot of people have that money is not real and that somehow that there's something weird about it. And I think it actually comes from how much money is abused and how much it is a tool of unaccountable power in our civilization. And I think that causes a lot of people. Like I just came across something again today on Facebook this morning about talking about people wanting to live without money. Like we can live without, we can evolve beyond. No, you can't. And it's like, unless money only exists because of scarcity. And so I go through in the article, I talk about how it's created by central banks and why that's, not in and of itself a problem. I mean, it's the manipulations that happen, the international money flows, the dark money, all of those things,
right.
That's a problem. But the existence of this thing itself, as a way of transferring value is, I think it's a really good system.
Well, that's what I liked about the article. You really get into the nuts and bolts of it. And you're right. There's so many conspiracy theories and just bizarre talk about, the Fed and big money
God.
And bank. It's really good to just ground it in, to get some perspective on it. So thanks. That was a great article.
Well, yeah. And I just one more little thing. And that is that it's kind of a paradox with a lot of people because everybody is angling and spending all their time trying to chase this thing. And then they're also saying that it's bullshit. So it's like, it's a real disconnect. And I think that you don't hear people who have plenty of money saying that it's not real. They take full advantage of that. And so you hear this coming from people who actually wish they had more of it. And of course, that's another problem that we can deal with in society by handling this inequality issue. And by the way, I also want to say as a general note that the climate question and our inaction is 100% a question of inequality. And it's the same problem. Like the same injustices that are taking place financially in our society are also a factor when it comes to the climate and why we haven't solved it. So I'll let you go ahead and introduce that subject.
Well said. And before we do that, let's go ahead and do the T-shirt thing, right? So, check mine out.
Okay, yours says, it's backwards. No
pasaran.
No pasaran. Okay.
So there's a great history behind this slogan. It comes from the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. It was an anti-fascist slogan at the time, probably one of the first Antifa sort of like saying. And it was then adopted all over the world, especially in Latin America, to fight against injustice and, abuse of power and dictatorships and so forth. And you still see it. People still use it. And you'll find the same message in French and in English and other languages. This shall not pass, or you shall not pass, is really what it means.
Yeah, and it's really funny because in our church we used to give up a prayer repeatedly and loudly. You shall not pass. So I think that is definitely something when anybody is fighting injustice or wanting to take a stand. It's a good phrase. So
yeah, and you might be wondering why I'm wearing it for a climate change show, but I mean, like you just said a few minutes ago, this is really about social justice. It's about equity and fairness. It's about a lot of the things we talk about all the time. Climate change is really a very pivotal issue, and it has all that. It is really fundamentally an issue about political power and political struggle in many ways. And because, the technology, we're just about there to have all the technology we need to really solve this problem. And we have the systems to solve this problem. What we don't have is a political will. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And we'll get into some of that.
Yeah. Well, and my shirt today says, Hail Sagan.
Hail Sagan. I love it. Yeah. I don't think I've seen that one before.
The reason I wore this shirt is not because we want to worship Carl Sagan, but because he has been probably in the last century the best public exponent for science and for science communication, and also for science to be applied to policy. And he foresaw exactly what's happening now. First of all, he talked a lot about climate change, and he was involved in real actual studies, early studies on climate change. And he also foresaw how our kind of degeneration of discourse and the lack of critical thinking was going to make it difficult to govern ourselves. And everything he said has happened. And so, I being science oriented, I don't really buy into the idea of worshiping anyone or saying hail to anyone. But if there's anyone who might cross that line or I might make an exception for, it would be Carl Sagan.
Right. I feel the same. I'm not really much into heroes or worshiping, but if I were going to worship anybody, he'd be up there on the list for sure. Okay, so let's briefly tap into some of the more newsworthy events. I mean, there's so much we could talk about, but let's just touch on a few items of note. The latest on the Delta variant is that the science is showing it to be twice as infectious and likely more lethal. More and more evidence coming out in that direction. The unvaccinated should take heed, but we all know about shoulds, right? This variant is spreading across the world very rapidly now. Where it strikes, infections spike without exception, even places with higher vaccination rates. And that's really interesting and important to think about. It is now hitting the U.S. I think it's roughly about 50% of cases right now, varies from state to state, and it will soon be 99% of cases within a month, I would say. We are now seeing the first Delta variant hotspots in the U.S. As one would expect, increasing hospitalizations correlate with areas of low vaccination rates. The vaccines are not as effective at preventing this disease, the Delta variant, although they are still effective at preventing serious Delta variant disease and hospitalization. So that's both good and bad. The consequences are that faster disease spread and greater danger for the unvaccinated. That's because those vaccinated may be relatively safe themselves, but they're becoming disease vectors again. And since areas of the countries, as we all know, have fallen behind in vaccination efforts, primarily because of the cultural intransigence and the irrationality we've discussed here, we go on and on about this. And of course, the more unvaccinated, the more the virus can mutate. So it's really a numbers game as well. It's not just this Delta variant. We could be seeing more variants coming down the line.
Yeah, well, this is incredibly disturbing. It's incredibly unnecessary. And this goes right along with the other subject that we're talking about. I mean, COVID is very much like climate change in the sense that it's a bit of a preview. I think we've mentioned this before on the show, but actually seeing people who there's death in their families, in their communities, and they're still unwilling to act, to do something as simple as get a vaccination that makes you feel a little funny for about 2 days, right? That's the only price there is. Okay, well, what chance do we actually have of doing things willingly in our society that are going to be much harder than that, much harder? Okay, like moving, like changing the way we eat, like changing the way we get around. Like there are so many things about climate change that are going to be even more devastating and deadly than what we're seeing here, and our people can't be bothered to do the simplest things. And I think that we've lost an incredible amount of social cohesion in this country since during my lifetime, because I can remember when I was a child that if the president said something, right, didn't matter what it was, people paid attention and they did it.
Yeah.
And people had that respect, so that if there was a national emergency, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That was said by a president who was assassinated before I was born. But at the same time, it set the tone for how things were. And I think that that is one of the costs of Trumpism, is that the loss of respect for a cohesive leader.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That is what we need here, because honestly, like, you will never solve the vaccination problem without a mandate.
Yeah. And actually the data bears out what you said. Under the Eisenhower administration all the way through Kennedy, I think trust in government was somewhere around 65, 70, 75%. Mm-hmm. If you look at the surveys, and today it's, I think, under 20%. Yeah. And in sometimes it dips even lower than that, a lot lower. So there's been a sea change in our society in that regard. And it's really a tragedy because of the issues that we have to deal with. And you're right. I mean, the pandemic is really a microcosm of the climate change. And we do face having to have some very tough decisions on a personal level, on a societal level, on a family level, in every single way possible. And it's hard to conceive how we're going to do that when we can't even wear masks. A lot of people just balk at that. But on the other hand, as you've mentioned many times, Sean, it is a systemic problem that requires systemic solutions. We're going to require large-scale collective solutions, as well as personal solutions. But that's really what's going to solve it.
Yeah, and I want to point out about that it's not just I'm not going to do this. As we've said before, the level of rage and hostility that is provoked by other people who comply. You saw this happen with masks, and you saw it even happen with vaccines, where the anti-vax groups came up with this ridiculous, preposterous, maddening theory of reverse contagion, where somehow someone who got vaccinated was a danger to those who were unvaccinated. I mean, this is what we're talking about, right? Yeah. Where easy things that we could do to fix the climate that everyone should want to do have suddenly now been recast as un-American, as anti-American, as somehow hostile and worthy of violence even.
Absolutely. I do want to say, though, the good news globally is this is not the case everywhere. It's the case in the United States. It's the case in a few other countries, Brazil, to some extent the UK, to some extent Australia, but in many, many other places, the opposite is happening, and people are taking climate change a lot more seriously, and that's good news. Unfortunately, the United States is so central in the world, such a powerful nation state, that it does make a huge difference that we have this problem here.
Yeah, I mean, what are we? 20% of global greenhouse emissions, something along those lines?
It's gone down quite a bit because China and India and other countries have really taken up a lot more of the slack. Yeah. But I mean, in terms of total emissions, like cumulative, the United States is still number one by far because it's been doing it for so long. But I think it's way below China now, way below. It's below 20%. Yeah.
Not surprised.
Yeah. This is a global issue, hugely global, hugely collective. And we're only going to solve it through global collaboration. That's the only way.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the forces that don't want to solve it, they have realized that also, and so I think that's actually has a lot to do with why there's been this resurgence of nationalism. I'm not being conspiratorial here. I'm saying if you're an oil company and you recognize that the world is getting together in Paris to put some things together with teeth, what you want to do if you're that oil company is to disrupt those efforts, and you can throw money at nationalist parties. I mean, it's easy.
Yep. And I have mixed feelings about doing a show on this issue, because I would love to do an expose on what the oil industry and fossil fuel interests have done in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to, but it enrages me. It makes me so angry because it is so horrible when you actually go and look at what happened. It is so bad. And I mean, I think I should just bite the bullet and do it at some point. But
yeah, we have to, because we know that that people knew. I mean, Exxon at some point in the 70s, I believe, they started doing their own internal research, and they spent millions of dollars funding research, which confirmed that CO2 was causing climate change. And so rather than acting on their research, they did the opposite.
Have you seen the released documents that have come out about that? I saw a chart that was created in the 1970s that was super accurate in terms of predicting what's happened today back by Exxon. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. And then, of course, I
was going to say, it is not just the crime of the century or the millennium, it's the crime of all time. And I think that's what we have to start talking about, is all of these areas of climate impact are crime scenes. I mean, there is a sort of a hierarchy of genocides that have occurred in the past. You know, you can look at Genghis Khan, you can look at the Black Death, you can look at Mao Zedong and the killing of, tens of millions of people in the Cultural Revolution. But this problem that we're having right now with global heating is going to dwarf all of those. Not just in absolute numbers, but in percentage of the human population, right? Yeah. We're looking at something, the only comparable thing that has occurred in human history is there was a period of time where there was volcanism that had wiped out humanity down to like 5,000 people.
Yeah, that was like 70,000 years ago.
Yeah. That's the only comparable event that to what we've already unleashed. And I think that when you look at some of what Al Gore said, and it cracks me up. You go back and look at, and it's not funny, but you go back and you look at Inconvenient Truth, and when he got that construction lift out and he got the graph, and he had to lift himself up like 30 feet in the air to get to the top of where the graph was going. And
I remember
people had this like nervous laugh reaction, like he was just talking about, the weather or something. And we're now seeing just the very barest beginnings of this.
That was what, 25 years ago?
No, it was only 2006.
Oh, okay.
When he did Inconvenient Truth.
Oh, right. And I honestly, what people don't realize is that in the last 20 years or so, around about that time, we've actually doubled the CO2 content in the atmosphere. So in all of human history, the thousands upon thousands of years, right, we put in X amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and then we doubled it in 20 years.
Double the human contribution, yeah.
The human contribution.
And also doubled the radiative forcing, I think it's called.
Yes.
Which is nonlinear, by the way. It's nonlinear. And a lot of people don't understand nonlinearity, and that's another big problem with climate communication.
It really is. So we'll talk more about this, but before, let me talk about one more thing about the news recently. I want to mention something about the critical race theory saga briefly. And there's actually parallels to climate change here too, because it is about scaring people. It's what I would call classic engineering of fear and hate for political purposes. I mean, there are clear echoes of the Cold War Red Scare here. Critical race theory fear mongering is the same dynamics, the same tactics of control, and some of that you find in the climate change denial movement. It's the very same thing.
Yeah.
And systemically, the right's effort to scare America, once again, the latest scare, right? It's one after another, with critical race theory is a means to power. That's what it's for, systemically. It motivates and unifies the right-wing base. And remember, as Hannah Arendt reminds us, power resides in the collective. The more invested people on your side, the more powerful you are. And on a personal level, the message resonates with many whites because it is a way to continue, right? It's a way to continue to deny the racism and past atrocities. Making critical race theory the new boogeyman provides an excuse not to do the necessary personal work required for a responsible and ethical human being. And we've talked about this so much in this show, right? That we really need to examine racism at all levels, particularly within ourselves. The denial continues, and so do the injustices.
Well, it's really interesting because I'm in the middle of a book right now, and it is called The Sum of Us. And it is talking about how much this has all hurt everyone, and including white people. And the book begins with the example of how we closed public swimming pools rather than integrate them.
Right.
White Americans decided to deny themselves the availability of a public pool for their children rather than share it. And that right there is a metaphor for everything, because what you see is that racism and the denial of racism, which is 100% of the problem, right, is the best way that the wealthy classes have figured out to maintain their position.
Right.
And so whenever you hear this stuff about critical race theory, what you're really hearing is wealth talking. And
great point.
And because if you think about it this way, if you're 1%, you've got to figure out a way to get 49% more or 50% more of the people to back you. And the only way to do that is through fear. The only way to do that is through trying to get the poor. And let's face it, most Republicans are poor. They're not, it's like they're not. The rich really is only the 1%. It's the vast majority of Republicans are just as poor as anybody else. And that goes all the way down into the white working class, et cetera. But they identify with the wealthy. And this is the problem. This is the same problem as with climate change, right? They revel the phenomenon of coal rolling, the phenomenon of people being conspicuous in their consumption of energy and things like that. It is, again, it's a distraction from the fact that climate change is a crime. It's a crime perpetrated by the wealthy on to the poor of the planet. And if the poor of the planet, which is everybody, all of us, we're poor compared to the 1%. If we all got together and decided to overthrow them, it would be over in a heartbeat.
It would be. Absolutely. Great points. Yeah. Anyway, let's go ahead and start the meat of the show here. Let's talk about the recent heat waves in North America. But I do want to say before I do that again, those news events do speak to power, as we have discussed often in this show. Climate change denial is all about actors in the world, as you just said, that use this issue for the purpose of power. Yeah. And hopefully we can talk a little more about that later. First, let's lay out the nature and the severity of the problem. I know maybe you folks out there have heard this many times about climate change, but I want to go into a little bit different perspective here. Maybe use a little more science. We're going to use a few visuals in the show today because they do very much help with understanding. I'll try to spell them out for our listeners for podcasts. In this case, I want you all to see just how extreme these heat waves have become. It is hard to believe. I mean, the tone of the chatter among meteorologists and climatologists is frankly amazement. And scientists don't use superlatives. They understate things. It's kind of part of the culture, part of the philosophy of science, right? Not this time. Many have publicly stated they are stunned this level of heat is happening now. They expected it, but not until later in the century. On July 5th, 1937, a place in Canada, I forget the name, reached 113 Fahrenheit. That record has never been broken anywhere until this June. That has been the all-time record. until I don't know how to pronounce this, Lytton, British Columbia, shattered that figure, reaching 121 degrees. So from 113 to 121. Canada broke its national temperature record 3 days in a row in several places. It was the hottest day ever anywhere on Earth above the 50-degree latitude line. To understand how bizarre this is, consider that centuries of old record keeping across the second largest continent in the world, a land area of 4 million square miles, a massive data set. And that data set was put in the dust, essentially. Yeah. So I want to show you this graph here, and it shows a normal distribution. So a typical bell curve. So you have the center is fat and tall, and the sides taper down to nothing. So if you plot the temperature data, you get a very smooth bell curve, because the more data points you have, the smoother the curve, right? If you have millions of data points, it's going to just be a perfectly beautiful curve. And near the fat center is the normal, and the graph tapers to extreme cold on one side and heat on the other. The most extreme recording, the all-time record, simply goes at the end of the line, and you barely notice it's there. But on June 27, several new points were added to this graph, and they look like this. Check this out. See those little orange dots at the end there?
Yeah.
They didn't even fall within the distribution.
Right.
For this to occur is a near impossibility, statistically, unless, of course, something has shifted. The patterns of history no longer apply. That's the reality of climate change. That's what we're talking about. And it's going to get far worse. This is what we'll be discussing today. Sean, you are well studied. We've talked about this a lot, you and I, in climate and climate statistics. Don't you find this simply staggering as I do?
Well, yes, of course I do. And I've been on the warpath about this for 20 years. And so it's just, I'm so far past the point of frustration with people not understanding what these things really mean, that these are danger signs that are unimaginable. And it's like there's I don't know what to call it, but it is there is something in humanity that I've encountered over and over again, which is this, I don't know if to call it familiarity bias or just a sense of, because predictions of doom and apocalypticism have been so destructive in the past, the attitude is always, well, this overblown. This is just, people are making, life goes on, this kind of thing. And so when they hear something like we're trying to keep the temperature from rising 2 degrees, people think 2 degrees, what the fuck does that even mean? Like, anybody can handle 2 degrees. Why are we going to change our entire world to compensate for this 2-degree thing? And it brings to mind, I read probably 10 years ago, I have to check to be accurate, but 9 or 10 years ago, Bill McKibben came out with this book called Earth, but it was EAARTH. I don't know if you've read that book, but
no, I've seen it, but I haven't read it.
It's a really great book with a really unfortunate name, because it looks wrong, looks like a spelling mistake. But his point is that we have no concept of the planet that we're going to be inhabiting. It's an alien planet. And that's what we have to understand. You're showing those, first of all, most people don't understand bell curves or standard deviations or outliers, you have to have a basic background in statistics to know how serious this is. But what we don't need science for is to understand that little town you talked about, it burned to the ground.
Yeah.
It burned to the ground. Okay. In about, in a matter of hours. And this is what happens when we get these extreme heat waves. The temperature was 121, but the ground, that's the air temperature. The ground temperature in large parts of the Northwest was 145. 145.
Amazing.
If you walk barefoot on the earth, you would get 2nd or 3rd degree burns. All right. That's what happens at those temperatures. Pets can't walk around. We have left the planet we all grew up on, and we are now residing on an alien planet.
Yes, and more people are going to realize this, Because this heat wave wasn't just a canary in a coal mine. This was like Fred, your body that works, mining coal with you, passing out and dying. I mean, it's happening now. It's not just happening in the Arctic where hardly anybody lives. It's happening in populated areas. And so it's going to be pretty dramatic in the next few years. This is not going to be pretty. And you're right. We are in a different planet with a different climate now already.
And here's what people don't understand is that there have been certain expectations that have been developed for living in civilization. And what these events and facts and figures do, they put all of those things into question. Everything from real estate property values, for your ability to even live, your ability to have a drink of water. I mean, these things are now no longer guaranteed. Even with all of the technology and money we have in modern civilization, we're going to be seeing breakdowns of these sort of default guarantees that we've all come to rely on. And I think that that's something that, again, we won't know from which direction these things are going to come. Like if somebody 2 months ago had said, hey, there's going to be this heat wave that's going to happen in Canada and it's going to be hotter than Death Valley. People would say, right. Are you nuts? And there are 100 things like that we don't know about right now in terms of tipping points and destabilization of currents. There and the impacts don't necessarily mean extreme heating everywhere. They mean some places like Europe, if the currents fail in the Atlantic Ocean, and they stop bringing the heat from the equator to north, then that could be cold, and there could be cold-related disasters.
Yeah, that's why it's called climate change.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to put it maybe in a more non-scientific, non-mathematical terms, imagine living in Boston and having a Phoenix-sized heat wave in Boston. That's literally what happened.
Yeah,
literally in Canada, just completely off the scale. And the same thing, by the way, happened last year in Siberia and in the Arctic. There was a massive heat wave that just broke all the records by just amazing amounts of degrees. So let's do a little bit of science here. I want to try to explain why these heat waves are happening, why the normal heat domes we all have lived with all our lives are so much more extreme now. It has to do with the jet stream and how it has been altered by human activity. It's important for all of you to understand the mechanisms and consequences of carbon loading in the atmosphere. I want to challenge people here. Even if you're not science-oriented or math-oriented, you can do this. You can understand this. It's not that difficult. So I'm going to pull up this image here. And what it shows is the northwest corner of the United States and the southwest corner of Canada. And this heat dome that's over. And you see all these lines converging in the center spot around British Columbia, and which is in all this red. And this is a depiction of the heat dome that caused those records that we just talked about. The red areas represent higher pressure as well as higher temperature. There's a very close relationship there. So inside this... Yeah.
PV equals nRT, right?
Exactly, right. If you know a little bit of physics, it's pretty basic. But inside this dome, the movement of the air is coming down vertically. So it's subsiding. So you don't have a lot of surface winds here. Under high pressure system, you tend to have gentle winds, if any. Sometimes it's calm. When the air is coming down, when it's descending, it piles up, creating more pressure. And what happens when you squeeze something, right? It gets hot. Like you pump up a bicycle tire quickly, and you notice a pump warming up. And the more you pump, the hotter it gets. It's exactly the same thing here. So heat domes or high pressure systems, which they're sometimes called, they're a normal part of the weather. We've seen them in the weather maps all our lives. However, they are moved and dissipated by global winds normally. What causes these winds has everything to do with the fact that the tropics are far hotter than the poles. Because, the sun shines much more intensely along the tropics. So the tropics receive a lot more solar energy because of the angle of the sun. All of the weather on Earth comes from nature attempting to fix this global energy imbalance. So the heat from the tropics wants to go northward and southward towards the poles. And it's carried there by wind and weather and ocean currents. And that's what we see on Earth. That's where we get all our rain and precipitation and temperature changes and so forth. The greater the difference in temperature between the poles and the equator, the more there's a slope of energy difference, the more rapid this redistribution is. In other words, the faster things move. What we have seen in the last half century is that the North Pole, in particular, has warmed up dramatically, 3 to 4 times as much as the temperate areas. And so there's much less of a temperature gradient or temperature difference between the North Polar region and the tropics. So the energy is less, right? And this warming is due to human activity, basically the greenhouse effect. And I'm sure you've all know a little bit about that, right? How that all works. The more greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane and so forth, the thicker the blanket around the Earth, preventing heat from escaping back into space. The sun heats the Earth, then in turn the Earth radiates the heat back into space, and there's an energy balance, right? And so you thicken the blanket, more heat is retained, the Earth is just going to warm up. So first and foremost, human activity, we're talking about fossil fuel use. And that activity has changed the global winds, particularly the jet stream for the upper part of the Northern Hemisphere, places like the United States and Southern Canada and so forth. So this great river of air now is acting very differently than it did before. So I want you to picture 2 rivers you've seen on maps or in real life, one on the gentle slope and one on the steeper slope. So they will look and act differently. The former on the gentle slope is going to be slow and it's going to meander. It's going to make big circles and oxbows, and the latter is going to be much straighter and faster, right? The slope is steeper and the energy is going to be stronger, so it's going to speed it up. And that's what's happening to the jet stream. It used to be a steeper slope, and the slope has gotten less. So this jet stream, the river, has become more meandering, had the more extreme curves, the slower the winds, and this allows the heat dome to linger over an area. So remember the pressure thing? The pressure and heat continues to pump up. You keep pumping and pumping and pumping, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. The winds aren't moving it. And that's why these records are being shattered.
It's something. Yeah. I mean, I'm really glad that you brought all of this up, because I never thought. I mean, I've been following climate science for a long time, and I never actually thought about thermodynamic heating in the atmosphere. Right? Mm-hmm. I've understood very well the resonance of CO2 molecules and CH4 and all the other greenhouse gas molecules, how that resonance traps the heat. But I did not think about thermodynamic heating, which, by the way, I want to mention, you mentioned the bicycle pump. And I would like to also mention the reverse process is how air conditioning works.
Yes.
You release the pressure and it absorbs heat and cools. So this is to the fact that we actually have heat pumping happening in our atmosphere
massively
now. On such a scale, is this warming is not just from solar radiation. It is now thermodynamic heating. And that's something that I think I never actually thought about before this recent heat wave.
Yeah, I mean, there's all these feedback effects, right? All these complex dynamics going on in the atmosphere. I mean, the greenhouse effect is really quite basic in comparison, right? Mm-hmm. It's easy to understand. It's real. And in fact, I don't know if you know this, but it's good that we have a greenhouse effect. There's a natural greenhouse effect that's been on the planet for a long, long time, millions of years, most of its history. And if it wasn't for the fact that we have greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, the Earth would be about 50 degrees cooler, which would mean it would be a planet of ice. Yeah. All the oceans would be frozen over. So thank goodness for the greenhouse effect. We've just added to it very quickly, very, very, very quickly in geological terms. And we're still catching up from that. We have the temperatures still not have caught up to the amount of carbon we've added to the atmosphere.
Yeah. This is something that a lot of people also don't understand, which just adds to the inability of the difficulty of communicating, is the lag, the latency in these effects, and how they take years to catch up. And even if we stopped increasing greenhouse gases tomorrow, that means we have emitted 0 additional carbon into the atmosphere, which is impossible. But if we could somehow do that, it would still get warmer for a number of years.
Yes, it would. And it's hard to say how much, but the estimates range is maybe around a half a degree warmer, just from that alone, not considering potential positive feedback effects from the Greenland and the tundra melting and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So that's pretty significant. And maybe less than half a degree, maybe a little more, but it's hard to say how much, but that's already built in. It's factored in. It's baked in.
Whatever it is, we should pay attention to it. The fact that there's uncertainty has been used for decades now to say, well, let's not pay attention to this forecast at all. And it turns out, if you look at the forecast from the 80s, as they predicted almost exactly where we are now. And of course, with science, there's error bars. Everybody knows that. This is not a crystal ball. This is science, which is a range.
So it's interesting. The predictions overall, in terms of the general temperature changes across the globe, have been very accurate. But there's been a lot of surprises, like, for example, how quickly the Arctic ice has melted and these heat waves. I mean, scientists weren't expecting this kind of extreme heat for a long time to come still. And it's because of the thermodynamic effects and all of these other complex effects that are happening. But the models predicted the overall global temperature regime changes quite well, even from the 1970s. It's pretty amazing if you think about it. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it's easy to know that there is a given amount of extra energy in the system, but with as complex as the Earth is, understanding how it's being distributed, how it's like looking at the clouds on Jupiter or something like that, right? How do you make sense of that? And we are, even though we're a smaller planet, we still have equally complicated dynamics when you start looking about, how air and water move and how energy flows around the planet. It's so the prediction was accurate in terms of the overall energy, but couldn't have predicted these chaos. It's chaos theory, really.
A lot of it is. And that's despite the fact that, there are tens of thousands of scientists working on this right now. And there has been for 50 years, right? All that, millions of human hours of work, right? Dedication. And so much effort has gone into trying to understand the climate. And we've done a great job, honestly, considering the complexity of it. We know enough. We know far, far to a high degree of certainty that we are basically entering a new phase of the Earth's climate now. We really do.
Yeah. It's something, again, I want to caution people against being fatalistic here, because there are two types of denialism. One type of denialism to say this isn't happening, I can ignore this. And the other type is to go, oh, we're all doomed anyway, so who cares?
Right.
And either way is giving up. We need to stay down the middle, because we still can have a major impact, and we will. I think we're going to get to the point where we are going to have to marshal all of our remaining economic and human resources to start a combination of geoengineering, capturing carbon. We don't have to just stop emitting carbon. We have to go carbon negative.
Absolutely. We're going to have to throw everything at this, everything we got. We do. And you know what? I am not that pessimistic in terms of the Earth is fucked, we're all going to die, the civilization is over. I don't believe that.
I don't either.
I honestly believe humanity will figure it out. I just hope that they do it soon. I just hope we do it soon. That's really, because the longer we wait, the worse it's going to be.
It's a strict question of cost. This is very similar to having a leaky pipe in your house, and the leaky pipe starts to, the water starts to spread and starts to take out drywall. It starts to rot wood, starts to do all these things. And every day, that you wait to fix that leak, it's going to get more expensive, and there's going to be more damage. And that's money that you're never going to get back. And, if you're insured, fine. But at a certain point, the insurance company is going to say, no, you're negligent, and they're not going to pay your claim. So my point here is that this is not your house. This is the planet. And we're talking about every minute that we wait, every year that we wait, it condemns us, another large group of people, to either death or misery.
That's right. It's simple as that. Now, let me finish up with my charts here. Just want to show you one more related to these bell curves here. So I want you to look at this other graphic that explains in a pretty good way the reality that we're in. One way to think about this with these graphs with climate change is that the bell curve distribution, so the ups and the downs and the tapering ends, just the whole thing just moves over towards the hot. So this is what the chart that I'm showing here now. You had the previous climate, what we're used to over the last several thousand years, and then you see the bell curve move over to the new climate, so that the percent chance of getting a heat wave rise dramatically, and the percent chance of getting cold snaps decreases dramatically over time. And so this happens both gradually and in phases and like in rapid pulses, like we've seen with these heat waves in Canada. The shift is not necessarily going to be gradual because of these complexities. So the same thing is happening with sea ice again, right? The sea ice is just it's time to collapse. Honestly, did you know, Sean, that compared to like the 1980, there's only 5% of polar sea ice volume left?
Yeah,
We've lost 95%.
I knew that. And I think we're going to see before too long, we're going to see just blue water conditions in those areas, which it's not. And that's not, again, people don't appreciate what that means, because also, as I'm sure, I don't even know if this is in your outline to bring up, but ice reflects sunlight. Blue water absorbs sunlight. So that's another example of a feedback loop.
That's a huge feedback. Yeah.
And I also want to point out that if you really want to think about what this bell curve and this shifting bell curve means, you got to put it in human terms. And that is that within the next couple of decades, we're going to see the number of days in excess of 100 degrees like double or triple every year. Right. So whereas, say you're living in a city and you have, a week's worth of weather, or the historical average was every summer you had a week's worth of weather that was above 100 degrees. Well, by 2040 or 2050, that's going to be 3 weeks. If it was 3 weeks before, now it's going to be like 2.5 months. Right. So you're talking about an increase of the misery index of living in a particular place.
Yes.
And then all the costs that go along with that. Heat-related disasters are some of the deadliest natural disasters that we face in the country.
Yes.
I think the death toll in Canada it's in the hundreds for sure.
Yes.
So
there was a heat wave back about 10 years ago in Europe that killed several tens of thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We're going to see more of that.
Yeah. So the other thing you said about the ice, it does change the albedo of the planet. So we absorb more of the energy of the sun because, the water absorbs a lot more energy than the ice. And that's already a case, by the way. There's some studies that show that 25% of global heating now is due to this changing albedo already. Yeah. Right. So, and if we lose more ice, it's going to be even more than that. So we're going to have to figure out a way to refreeze the Arctic. Literally. We're going to have to do that.
And the only way to do that is to pull out the easiest way to turn down the temperature is to extract CO2 from the atmosphere. That is and so everything is going to focus on that, and it's going to have to. And I hope that we have the wherewithal to accomplish that by the time, if we don't start. The problem is that these climate impacts reduce our capacity. They reduce our economic capacity. They reduce our ability to operate. You saw breakdowns in the Northwest. Grocery stores were they couldn't keep the food cool. The public transportation, the power went out because cables were melting. Roads were buckling. All right. I mean, this is such a change. And by the way, there's nothing we can do about it, right? Like if you, these conditions they're happening. Like one day you wake up and all of a sudden, systems are breaking down. And so this is why we need to take maximum advantage of the remaining time that we have before systems break down further.
Absolutely. And Sean, you've talked about this before, but you mentioned just a little while ago about nonlinear change. And, change happens linearly sometimes, but non-linearly other times. For example, a glacier can move gradually and slowly for years and years and years. And then all of a sudden it cleaves. That cleaving releases energy pressure and the glacier just speeds really, really quickly, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a pulse shift that happens and change can happen very dramatically. And this is what we're seeing now. in regional places like in Northwest United States with this heat wave and parts of Canada. That's nature, right? That's what climate change is. Sean, can you say a little more about that? Because I know you explained it well before.
Well, look, I mean, in math, there are, like, most equations are either, if it's a curve, if it's a line or a curve, right? But there are certain functions in math where you have a curve is going along to a certain point, and then there's a discontinuity where it jumps, and then you have, and the state goes in, and you learn more of that. It's not just in math, but it's also if you're looking at systems of feedback, right? Control theory.
Right.
If you're looking at those things, that's when you begin to really understand nonlinearity and tipping points, where a system can become unstable and then completely move into a different stable state. And I think that one way of visualizing this is if you had a surface and there's a ball rolling around on the surface, and there are dips and depressions in the surface. And so we've been in the Holocene part of our existence, which is the situation in which we evolved. We've had a pretty stable ball, in a gradual depression, right? And climate has started to perturb that. And if it goes too far, we go out of that area where we've been resting, and we go into a much deeper hole,
right?
Of where this situation, and evolution took us, millions of years to evolve for a specific climate, and we won't be able to. People say, "Oh, you can adapt." Not exactly, because it has to do with our food, the ability to grow food. It has to do with the entire web of the ecosystem that is interdependent. And so when you make a shift like that, you go through a nonlinearity. There's no guarantee that you'll ever get back to that stable state.
There isn't. Probably not. Certainly not in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe thousands of years. I mean, depending on human technology, human ingenuity, what happens, but
that's our only chance, because basically technology and technological methods are the only way that we have of leveraging our brains and our strength to do something about this system, which is so much bigger than we are.
No, in science fiction, like in Star Trek, I have to mention that at least once, right?
Yeah.
In Star Trek, there are the episodes about terraforming planets, right? Where you go in, you try to make the planets more habitable for sentient species and so forth. And that's what we'll be having to do with planet Earth. We'll have to terraform planet Earth. We'll have to use very, very extensive technologies to try to do things like refreeze the Arctic. And it's going to be quite a challenge.
Well, the cost of it is just astronomical beyond anything that we've ever thought of, unless we can bring, sort of novel methods to bear on this, right? Because the scale that we need, for example, the things in our history that have actually cooled the Earth have been like volcanic eruptions, right? Volcanic eruptions can cool the Earth. Now, if you can imagine the volume, I mean, cubic miles of material can come out of a volcanic eruption, right? And so to marshal that kind of force with human scale technology, it's almost impossible. But there is a method where you can load sulfur particles onto airplanes, fly them up to the upper atmosphere, release them, and you can create a certain amount of cooling. There are techniques that we could use. And for a while, a lot of environmentalists were opposed to these things because they were saying, well, if we do that, then it's just going to encourage us to keep emitting fossil fuel emissions. And the fact is, now we're past that debate. We're to the point where if we want to preserve any part of what we've come to count on in terms of a climate, we have no choice. Right.
Well, somebody's having a heart attack, and you have to rip their chest open to try to keep them alive.
Yeah.
So that's what we're getting to.
We're getting to that point.
Yeah. But, climate change has affected human populations already. People keep talking about it's going to affect. It's been affecting. It's been making changes in the planet now for decades, right? It's already caused tens of millions of extra deaths in the world already, and a great deal of suffering already. The sad fact is that as a world, we have been in denial of these changes for decades. And of course, this fault isn't simply due to the foibles of human nature, right? We can talk about people are short-sighted because of evolutionary adaptation or whatnot. We can talk about all that, and that's all cool stuff and important. But more important than that is we cannot ignore, as you mentioned earlier in the show, in the beginning, the willful and criminal manipulations of the fossil fuel stakeholders. right? Corporations and nation states. We have grossly ignored it, and now we're paying a great price. There should have been consequences for those criminal acts, and they still should be.
Yeah, well, I happen to think that most of, if not all, of the incredible shift that we've seen toward insane conservatism. I mean, you have to remember 1956. There's a couple of factors. It's not just one factor, but 1956, the Republican Party platform basically matches the 2020 Democratic platform.
Yeah.
And that shift largely occurred. I mean, we can talk about racism and systemic racism and all of that, and how that shifted after the Civil Rights Act. Okay, that's a big part of it. But also, what they realized is that if they can get, because fossil fuel companies, when they did this research, they paid for this research, right? And they knew exactly what was coming. They also knew that if democratic priorities prevailed, that it's in the national interest. I mean, we've been hearing from the military, from the national security community, that climate change is the number one threat to our, we've been hearing that now since the early 2000s, right? And yet one party is steadfastly preventing us from dealing with this incredible national security issue. Okay.
Yeah.
And so it is a crime, but I also have to think about this in terms of what wealth does and what power does in preserving itself. It's very much like the old story of the scorpion, and the frog, swimming across the river.
Right.
Capitalism and wealth can't help destroying itself. It's in its nature. And that's the punchline of the joke. And, no matter what, it's like, no matter how badly that scorpion wanted to get across the river, it's gonna sting, the frog and get killed. So,
Yeah. Unfortunately, you're absolutely right. I completely agree with you. It is the systemic in that way, and we have to challenge that. And obviously, you do it to solve climate change, to solve racism, to solve global poverty. All of these issues are related to that fundamental dynamic that you just talked about, right? Capitalism, I'm not going to say capitalism is all bad and evil and so forth. It had its role in global history. It really did. But it may be an outmoded and outdated way of managing our resources and our economies. I think that the evidence is pointing more and more in that direction. It's just, we need to find better ways.
It's an open loop condition, right? It is a runaway train without a governor. And that is the problem. Markets are a great source of information. We need markets, okay?
Right.
But capitalism itself, running the train flat out off a cliff or into a wall or whatever your metaphor is the problem. And what capitalists have done, unfortunately, is to block the regulation that would slow the train down slow enough to make it around the curve or do whatever else it needs to do to navigate the landscape, right? You don't want to have only one setting of the pedal to the metal. Right.
Christoph, who's not here, always talks about the bad faith arguments and bad faith strategies and so forth of the right and so forth. There's certainly a great deal of that with climate change. I mean, some of the tactics and some of the things that they did were just I don't have time to go into them now, but at some point we will. Right. It's pretty stark.
Well, we know that the same tactics were used with lead, with tobacco, et cetera. It's the same, but now we're talking about, lead and tobacco were things that killed a lot of people, hurt a lot of people, but this is going to affect everyone. We can't afford to wait to fix this. Yeah,
I mean, fossil fuel is the center of the 20th century capitalist economy, right? It is the heart and soul of it. It is so central. It's like, the cigarette companies were powerful, absolutely, but nothing compared to the fossil fuel, mega complex that exists on the planet. Amazingly powerful, and still is. So it's much more of a challenge. For example, with when we tackle the smoking cancer issue, right? The cigarette company and tobacco executives, they weren't giving a seat at the table.
No.
Right. But you know what? Guess what? Exxon's being giving a seat at the table now for climate change. That's the difference, right?
It's part of the too big to fail sort of mentality. And I want to mention that Elon Musk in a speech, or it was answering a question at a fossil fuel industry gathering sometime in the last 5 or 10 years, and he said, "Look, if I had a switch right now and I could switch off fossil fuels tomorrow, I wouldn't push that button." And the reason is because we are dependent. Like right now, all of our electricity would switch off. All of our, we would have a lot of problems if we immediately eliminated it. So that's not what's required to suddenly stop on a dime.
Right.
What would have gradually put us through this change is if we had just changed the incentives a little bit, just reduced the subsidies a little bit, made renewable energy compete a little sooner with fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And that would have, over time, now, instead of having negative feedback effects where things are getting worse, you would start to have positive feedback effects in the economy, where we not only are we generating more of our power and getting more of our transportation from renewables, but we're also gradually reducing the power of these fossil fuel executives, right? Because now suddenly there's a wind lobby, there's a solar lobby, there's all these other things that needed to come on a lot stronger, a lot sooner. And,
if only.
Yeah, if only.
If only. I mean, if we had done this in the 90s even, right?
Yeah.
I mean, okay, it would have taken us 2 decades to realize it from the 70s to the 90s. I mean, honestly, scientists were talking about climate change back in the mid-19th century, but that's another story. But if we had only done what we needed to do back in the 90s, it's kind of like, another analogy is there's an asteroid coming at the planet. And if you can divert it when it's really far away, you only have to divert it a tiny fraction of a degree. But the closer it gets, the more energy you need to divert it. The closer it is, the more you have to divert it, the more radical the solution has to be. And it was just a loss of an opportunity,
It's a great analogy. I mean, and you could come up with no end of analogies, penny wise, pound foolish behavior. And the fact is, we're still subsidizing our governments, our tax dollars are still paying fossil fuel companies to produce. And as a matter of fact, there have been some legislation, I think it's Ohio, where the fossil industry succeeded in getting a money-losing coal plant to get state funds to continue operating. Okay, this thing is losing money and it's killing us, and we're paying for it.
So again, it's a political problem, right? Because now green energy is competitive, price cost is competitive with fossil fuel. So what's the excuse, right?
This is when they really get dirty. Like it used to be, well, the government shouldn't pick winners, and why are you forcing us to use this expensive renewable energy? That was the argument before. Well, now that it's cheaper, now they have to really take the gloves off.
Right. Exactly.
And just, we're going to force you to pay us. That's what they're doing now.
Yeah. So anyway, with that, I want to say one more thing about fossil fuels. A better way to leave from what we were just talking about, a better way to understand the destruction and the danger associated with these resources is to look at it from the point of view not just of climate change, but fossil fuels not only release greenhouse gases that warm the earth, like we've been talking about, they're also highly toxic to humans and to the environment. And we've just tolerated that for more than a century, right? CO2 warms the earth. CO, carbon monoxide, destroys lung tissue, right? Pollution kills millions of people a year. Some studies suggest as much as 9 million people die every year in the world because of pollution, right? And fossil fuels, fossil resources not just kill people, they sicken hundreds of millions of people yearly. The costs are staggering, lost work, sickness. The healthcare costs alone have been a great burden on societies. And we've just accepted them, right? No externalities. Didn't even consider it until very recently. Even look at the US, where pollution controls are among the best in the world. Our air is relatively clean in comparison. The cost of fossil fuel diseases like emphysema, asthma and so forth, run in the hundreds of billions of dollars, right? And what if we didn't have to pay those costs? In India, where pollution is among the worst in the world, it's estimated today that it's losing about 9% of its gross national product every year because of pollution. That's a vast amount of money. And you can make the same argument about environmental and ecological damage, right? Eliminate the use of fossil fuels in the world and people become significantly healthier. Not only is that of a great benefit, we always talk about human flourishing, right, for ethical reasons, and ecological sustainability, all of that, but it also frees up these vast amounts of money to use for other things, including stopping climate change, which we'll need. And we have to do this. I mean, what's your take on that, Sean?
Okay, well, this gets back into what we always talk about, which is libertarians, individualism, inability to understand systems and systemic effects. Every example of pollution is theft, right? It's theft from the commons.
Yeah.
We can say, okay, well, everybody benefited, right? We had the Industrial Revolution. We've raised standards of living. We've increased the amount of food we're producing. We've done all these things, right? And that's good, but we've also stolen from the commons opportunity to do things that we could have done in the future. And I talk about this all the time. When you lose snowpack or you lose a glacier, you lose a natural reservoir. So now you've got to pay to construct something if you want to store that amount of water, right? So, and the same thing is true with human health effects. If you suddenly tolerate having a lot of health problems, well, now the society's got to, you either raise insurance premiums, you have to, people are paying higher medical bills in general. Like, it is not free. Polluting is not free. Right. And even if a lot of times it takes a long time with climate change after the Industrial Revolution, 150, 200 years for the bill to come due, right? But it's going to come due. And so every time that you pollute into the environment without regard for this natural systems that you're affecting, you're stealing from the commons. You're stealing from the ability of those systems to support life. And I don't know how to convey this to people who don't think systemically. It is impossible. Eyes glaze over. People, they tune out. They're like, "Oh, what's for dinner, man?" It's.
No, it is hard it's very hard and frustrating to convey. I mean, I'm an educator. I've been teaching about climate change. I think about this all the time. It's very challenging to convey, especially to an unreceptive audience, right? It's one thing when people willingly go to your course, right, and take it, but and they're a little more open, but to the general public, very challenging.
Yeah.
And, one more, okay, guys, one more image and then I'm done with images. Okay, I want to show you. This next chart is by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. It's a UN scientific body. It now arbitrates climate change science for the world. This image shows where humanity and the planets are most vulnerable and why we must stop climate change. So the chart looks like this. There are a whole bunch of columns, red on the top and green on the bottom. And then on the y-axis, you're going from 0 temperature change to 7 degrees Celsius temperature change. And so the higher up you go, the more of a temperature change you see. So the columns are labeled as water security, coastal communities, energy security, major infrastructure, health-related deaths, tourism, agriculture and forestry, food security, natural ecosystems, and sustainable development. So we are right now at about 1.25 degrees Celsius higher than basically the baseline temperature of the planet prior to industrialization. So we've gone up about 1.25 degrees Celsius, or about 2 degrees something Fahrenheit, right? And if you look at this chart, you notice that even with only that much temperature rise, we are already at or beyond the coping range, the green area, in all of these categories. And beyond that, you get into the yellow and oranges, and that requires mitigation, right? That you have to make significant changes in the laws and the infrastructure in order to deal with the disruptions. And also, of course, the use of new technologies, implement those as well. And you can see...
I just want to interrupt really quick here. When you say mitigation is a very neutral sounding word, I'll tell you what it really means. You're going to pay. You're going to pay through the nose. Okay. Right. You are going to pay money. It is going to reduce your standard of living. Mitigation means less money for you. Okay.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's great because it's part of the jargon of climate change, science and policy. People use these terms, but yeah, you're absolutely 100% right about that, man. Absolutely. Now you can see by the chart, we'll be entering the vulnerability zone, right, which is the red marker, right? Then that's a position where even with mitigation, even with great effort, you cannot stop the damage anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the most vulnerable of the columns is a natural ecosystem column. And if you look at that one, right, we have been unable to stop already the rapid extinction and decline of wildlife on the planet. And this is despite, just so many valiant mitigation efforts around the world to try to do that. And you can see that we are already in the red zone. And if anything, this chart is underestimating things a bit. It could use a little bit of updating.
Yeah, well, okay. And I have to go after this other word, vulnerability. Right. Mitigation means you get to pay. Vulnerability means you're going to die. Okay, yeah. That's what that means. That's people are going to die. And particularly you look at natural ecosystems might not necessarily affect people, except when you think about things like the bees. Pollination services, okay? When you think about all the bacteria in the soil that are required to maintain the web of life to grow food. All right, so that is the first thing to fail. But then right behind it are water security, coastal communities, okay? Already, we've got people living in the Southwest in the desert. Where I am right now, okay, I'm in near Vegas in Henderson, Nevada, and I'm looking at my phone right now. It's 116 degrees here, okay? And Lake Mead, which is our main water supply for the entire Southwest, is only about a third full. And they have waited until it's 2/3 empty to even implement any sort of federal restrictions. Okay. So you've got that going on in dry areas. You've got coastal communities being inundated. Where do you think the money's going to come from to fix all this stuff?
Exactly. Yeah. And I'll tell you, I lived in Argentina for a year, and part of it was in the Chaco, which is a super hot region without air conditioning, right? And I've been in 116, 118 degree temperature without air conditioning, living in those. It's brutal, man. It's brutal. Yeah,
you can't function. We would have literally if my air conditioning broke and I couldn't fix it, I'd have to abandon my property. I couldn't live here.
Yeah, and we lived outside. We literally could not go in we had a little hut we lived in, and we couldn't go in it. We'd have to wait till around midnight before we could go in it because it's that hot inside. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Insane. That must have been really, really tough.
We were young and healthy, and we could do it. Now I think I'll probably die, Anyway, John, what can you tell our audience about the here and now consequences? Aside from the heat waves and so forth, is there anything else we haven't mentioned that is particular concern for you?
Yeah, political consequences. Because when things get chaotic, governance breaks down. Yeah. And we've already seen it. Like we already talked about at the beginning of the show, how lack of social cohesion causes us to be unable to deal with COVID. And we just can't seem to bring ourselves to tell people, get your fucking shot. Okay. Like that is like what is wrong with us? And we also can't tell people you're gonna have to stop burning fossil fuels. The price of gas has got to go up, right? You tell people that, they revolt. And so this is what I see is that when we start making the kinds of changes that we're going to need to make, there's going to be revolts and violence. And I think that there are plenty of people who would rather die than live in a world where we do the responsible thing. And so that concerns me, because when we get overwhelmed by nature, okay, a lot of people will blame whoever's in charge, and you get a lot of scapegoating. Trumpism, even, I believe, has a lot to do with climate change.
I agree.
The insanity. What else would drive people that insane other than this sort of existential dread that people are feeling, and they want a strong man to make everything right, and he tells them what they want to hear. And so I fear that globally we will have to deal with a rise of strongmen who to respond to this. And frankly, in some ways we need it. Like if right now, if I could appoint a strongman to force everybody to get their vaccine, I'd do it, because it's that critical, right? We would rather people survive, okay, than have their so-called freedoms to not get vaccinated. And it's the same thing with climate change.
Same thing.
If I could appoint a strongman to just enforce carbon regulations, nothing else, not do any, no, but just say, America, get your fucking shit together. We're going to increase the carbon tax 10% a year until you get it right. We're going to, we need action. And left to their own devices, individuals won't do it. They're not going to vote for these kinds of changes. And so that is my biggest sort of takeaway, is that we're like kids. We need at this point, when it comes to things like climate change, collective action problems like COVID or whatever, we need a spanking. As much as I hate spankings. I don't like violence, but as a metaphor for our society. All right. Parents, don't spank your kids, but as a society, we need a kind of political spanking.
Yes. Well, any reasonable person would agree with you if they knew the facts, because that's how dire climate change is. Yes, that's distasteful to have that control over you and that kind of thing. It jars badly with our political philosophy and all that. But consider the consequences if we don't get our shit together. Consider it. They are beyond dire. So yeah, how can I disagree with you? How could I? I can't.
Well, and the sad part about all this is that the likelier outcome is that we will get strongmen who will take advantage of the situation and commit acts of barbarism that this is what keeps me up at night, is thinking about the political response to all of this, right? Because we could solve the problem just like we can stop people from dying of COVID, but will we?
Right. The political thing is really interesting because we've re-examined a lot of global history with this idea in mind. What was the effect of climate on global history? And a lot of new scholarship has shown that, like, for example, one classic one is the Mayans, right? Back remember in the 1980s and so forth, the Mayans just mysteriously disappeared, right?
Right.
It was climate change. That's what did it to them, right? The climate change, they denuded their forests, the climate shifted, lack of resources, resource scarcity caused conflict, and they killed each other, right? That's what happened.
It's the same thing on Easter Island, right? Easter Island, they cut down all the trees. They didn't have, and there's been other things like, I read recently that in Saudi Arabia, that there were lush fields suitable for keeping cattle, as many as recently as within the last 10,000 years. So climate has changed, and it has affected civilizations. It has been a dominant force in world history, and will continue to be so.
Yeah, even the Roman Empire now, there's good evidence now that it went through a major climate shift when it collapsed. And why did the Nordic tribes invade the Roman Empire? Because they were stressed by climate change. Mm-hmm. That may be the reason why. Why did they do that? And so you go back in history and you start to see this clear pattern that having a stable climate is essential to civilization. It really is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for sure.
So let's finish up with something a little bit more positive, because I totally agree with you, Sean. We cannot fall into hopelessness. And I noticed that the usual course for people goes like this. They tend to ignore this problem, think it's no big deal with other things in their lives. And then finally, somehow they see it, they start to pay attention, and they fall to despair, or they become nihilistic, one or the other. But in both cases, it's the world is fucked. There's nothing we can do about it. And it's a common trope, and it's so self-defeating. We have to do better. So, Sean, can you help us kind of think about, and you do a lot of thinking about energy systems and green energy and so forth. What are some of the ways that we can think about mitigating climate change this way? Like, reducing carbon in the atmosphere. What's possible?
Really, when you actually look at the Green New Deal, okay?
Yeah.
It is one of the best proposals that anyone has ever come up with, because this is not some hair shirt environmentalist thing. This is a way to improve job security, because a lot of the infrastructure and climate work that we need to do in this country, it's non-outsourceable. These are jobs that cannot be shipped overseas, right? Okay. And then the other thing is that we're still throwing away every year massive amounts of money into fossil fuel subsidies. You end those subsidies tomorrow, okay? And where does that money go? That money goes into green energy and, again, green jobs. And this is why the Republicans have worked so hard to demonize the Green New Deal, because this is what we need to do. And I'm telling you, like, the prosperity that we could unleash, it's not just for our country either, because there is going to be a global race for this technology that it's already well underway.
It is.
And China is come on very, very strong in this. And, somebody's going to be making the world's solar panels. Somebody's going to be making the world's air capture, direct air capture machines that can pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so this would be like getting in on the ground floor of, say, semiconductors or some other something that has just profoundly taken over the world.
Right.
And so this is what we need to do. And by the way, I want to say something about how certain technologies can actually be a foil for climate progress. Like, for example, there's two that come to mind directly, and that is hydrogen and nuclear. Mm-hmm. Those two things purport to be solutions for climate change. But in reality, this is the sort of pivot that the fossil industry has done. It's like, well, okay, we believe climate change is real, but let's build a bunch of nuclear plants. No, you can't do that. All right. And the reason why is because they cost too much. And the same is true for hydrogen. Like, the energy equation just doesn't pencil. You're much better off charging batteries. You're much better off, working on grid scale storage than hydrogen. Now, there may be certain aspects of energy production where if you put that energy, that surplus energy that you're getting from renewables, into producing hydrogen, that's something that you can store and move around, and there might be a place for some of that. But what ends up happening is that some of these technologies that are a dead end get pushed by the fossil industry as a way of sort of a poison pill, saying, it's so
more bad faith.
It's bad faith. And listen, this is a titanic battle between titanic forces. There are gobs of money at stake. Trillions upon trillions of dollars a year are at stake with the fossil industry and it's all of its related investment industry, everything. So, and they know that once we make this change, we're never going back. This is a one-way ticket. So
it is.
I think that the key is that we have to start seeing these climate mitigation measures as having great knock-on benefits, kind of like the space program.
Good point. And you know what? We are seeing that, because you think about, go back 10 years, let's say, and 10 years ago, the price of green energy still wasn't really price competitive. Now it is. And in fact, it's cheaper. That's a huge phase shift in a way. It really is a phase shift, potentially, because now countries can't make the argument, we can't afford to switch to green energy because it's too expensive. In fact, it's cheaper. The other thing that's changed in your line of reasoning is that now there's a number of countries that have successfully transitioned. And as they've done so, their economy has not suffered. Their economy has done better. And those are models for other countries now. You can't make that argument anymore. I mean, you can try, but here's your evidence, right? Costa Rica, places like that.
The argument has shifted from, these things won't ever work, right, to just lying about it. Yeah. They used to have
they do lie. They lie.
They used to have their data on their side, right? Because there was no example of a society being completely powered by green energy. They could say that truthfully. Now there is an example, and they still say it. I couldn't believe that after all these decades of development in renewable energy, they came out with this campaign a few years ago. Wind dies, sun sets. And they went right for the jugular because that is the weakness of renewable energy. It's intermittent, okay, but batteries are coming on strong, and other forms of energy storage are coming on strong. And again, these people just don't think systemically. And I still get just guff from people who don't understand how electric cars work, or how, they think they're going to have to sacrifice it. It's going to be hair shirt environmentalism and they don't understand these things are better. They're better in every way.
Yeah, they really are. Electric cars are a superior product. Even if you take everything else aside, they really are.
Yeah.
And many other things are too. I have solar panels. I love my solar panels. They're awesome.
Yeah.
I haven't sacrificed a thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, for example, the kind of weather I'm dealing with here, I have solar panels as well, and my bill's like $120 or something like that. Whereas without the solar panels, it'd be like well over $300.
Air conditioning,
to run this kind of air conditioning. So this is something that I think that it becomes inevitable. Like one of the casinos here, they just decided they were tired of the power company dragging its heels, and they built their own solar field. And they've disconnected themselves from the power company, and they're
awesome.
And they're taking, they're making energy for themselves. Now, I don't know the exact. I'm sure they're still connected to power lines, but you know what I mean. They're not buying their power from them anymore. And
and the other big political change that I've seen, which it really isn't talked about in the media very much, but it's very encouraging, is that there is a shift in the global politics about this. And a lot of countries and a lot of global corporations are now really, at least at the rhetorical level, talking very differently and in some cases acting very differently in terms of doing some real changes to try to stem this problem. They really are. I mean, it's a huge change. And the thing is, I mean, it goes back to with George Bush Sr., right? Mm-hmm. The Kyoto protocols would have happened if it wasn't for the United States, right? So it's not like this is completely new. We could have had mandated, right, regulations back then. So that energy is still there. So as these forces, these retrograde forces that are stopping this change come across more and more block walls, like reality, they're going to give way, and they are giving way.
They're giving way, but the question is, we've got these two opposing. We've got the climate destabilization, and then we've got the forces of climate progress, and they're just on such a collision course right now.
They are, and honestly, I try to be optimistic, but I also need to be realistic. It's very sober. The best case scenario is a horrible scenario. Yeah. Right? The worst case scenario is unthinkable, but we need to get to the best case scenario. And the other thing that I would say, I know before I say that, but do you have any closing thoughts about any of this?
I think we've said it all. I've been saying the same thing for 20, 30 years to anybody who would listen. And it's just that now it's 20 years later, and now we're actually starting to be severely impacted. And again, it's nonlinear. All right. So
it is.
0 to 20 was kind of like this. 20 to 40, we're talking about a much greater impact and much faster.
And that's why people think we're fucked. But here's the thing. Change can be nonlinear too. Our efforts to stop climate change are also nonlinear. And at some point, we're going to hit that hockey puck curve, and the world is going to mobilize and do something about it. There's no question about that. It just depends on when and to the extent that it happens. I said, the earlier the better. But at some point, the disasters are going to be more and more intense. The evidence that green energy works is getting better and better, right? The politics are dissolving. Yeah. And there's going to be a massive resistance still. It's not going to be pretty, but it's inevitable that the world will shift in this direction. I just hope it happens fast. That's it.
I hope I live to see it.
Yeah. Because at some point, we could get to a place where there is no possibility of fixing this at all. And I think that in the future, we're going to see a world, like you said, that's going to be 100%, energized to deal with this climate issue. And we're going to see climate mitigation and climate change and energy and everything everywhere. It's going to be a central part of life. That's what it's going to take.
It's really the issue of all of our lifetimes. There's nothing more important.
And I think this was a really productive and interesting conversation. Thank you so much for sharing this with me. I hope you folks enjoyed it. If you liked our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. We also publish new articles weekly in our journal at theradicalsecular.com. I'm Joe Okipinti. Thank you for being here. And remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.
The Radical Secular podcast is written and produced by Christoph Defoe, Sean Prophet, and Joe Okipinti. Logo and main title designed by Tim Stetner. Post-production and original theme music by Sean Prophet. Special thanks to our support team, Lindsay Brightman, Jillian Sky Jacobs, and Lori Field Okipinti.